Kelsey. I have my booktube hat, and today I am filming my series review for Renée Adieh's duology, which consists of The Wrath and the Dawn and the second book, The Rose and the Dagger, which is this one. I have this out from the library. I also got the first book from the library, but I sent it back after I read it several months ago. So this is the book that I have out right now, so this is the one I will be holding up. This second book came out last month, so it's a relatively new release. But I will be talking about both books in this video. I can't quite remember which month it was that I read the first book, but I will link that wrap-up for you so you can see my individual thoughts on that book when I first read it. This is a young adult fantasy duology, heavy on the romance. And honestly, I find it a little difficult to review something like this because to me, these books were mostly just sort of fluff. And I don't mean fluff in terms of the tone. The tone of this series is actually pretty dark and moody. I mean it more in terms of content. There just wasn't a whole ton in this duology where come the end of the second book, I felt like I really wanted to pull it apart and talk about it. And to be honest, if I did not read a significant amount of this sort of fluff, I feel like I would lose my mind. I feel like as a reader, it's really important to my reading happiness to sort of intersperse books like this with books that are heavier reading. That said, this is a pretty popular YA duology, so I'm guessing there are a lot of people out there who will want to hear more about it. So my goal, as always, is to talk about these books to you in a way that I hope will help you decide whether or not this is something you want to read. This is historical fantasy set in Khorasan, which is a historical region in modern-day Iran. The first book was a loose retelling of the story of Scheherazade, which is the framing device for the 1001 Nights, otherwise known as the Arabian Nights. So I see this as part of sort of a trend in YA fantasy to incorporate more culturally diverse settings, which is always a good thing. That said, and I don't speak as an expert here because I don't actually know the history of this region of the world very well, I got the sense reading these books that they weren't the sort of historical fantasy that's really thoroughly researched. Renée Adieh strikes me as the kind of author who takes the approach of, well, obviously it's not real history because this is an alternate world with magic, so I can do whatever I want. I find reading adult fantasy that I prefer it when authors put in the effort. But I kind of give YA a pass in that regard. I also know that these are Renée Adieh's first books. The Wrath and the Dawn was her debut novel. I also felt like, as a retelling of the story of Scheherazade, the first book was the sort of retelling that latches onto just the things that are known in popular culture about the story and then runs with them without digging much deeper. That's also something that I tend to be fine with in young adult retellings. While in adult retellings, I tend to look for something that's deeper and more thoughtful in how the source material is selected and addressed both plot-wise and thematically. So those are some things that could have bothered me if I let them, but because this is a young adult fantasy from a new author, I kind of let a lot of things slide, and I engaged with this duology on sort of a fluff reading level. Now, I really liked the first book. I gave it 4 stars. The second book was a little disappointing to me, and I'll get into why a bit later, but I still enjoyed it, I still read it very quickly, and I still gave it 3 stars. For those of you who don't know, the story of Scheherazade is essentially about a king who doesn't believe that a woman can be faithful, so he marries a new woman every night and has her slaughtered in the morning until Scheherazade comes to him with a plan to tell him stories all night and leave him at a cliffhanger at the dawn. And so he wants to keep her alive to keep hearing the stories. And after 1001 nights, he realizes that he loves her and that she will be faithful and they live happily ever after. The stories that Scheherazade tells are the main contents of the Arabian Nights. The Wrath and the Dawn took the emphasis off the stories and put it on the romance. It gives us a hint at the beginning that there is a magical reason that this tortured young king is being forced to kill all of his wives. Shahrazad, who is the Scheherazade character, comes in with a plan to seek vengeance, but discovers that not all is as it seems. She has to unravel the mystery, and she falls in love in the process. The writing had a kind of indulgent, atmospheric feel that I really liked, and I sped through that book. The first book basically uses up the source material, but sets up a much larger action-y plot for the second book to take over. And this to me felt like much more average YA fantasy adventure fare. Plot-wise, this actually did pretty much literally all of the things I was hoping the plot would do. I tend to do this where I get to the end of a book, if it's part of a series, and I kind of find myself guessing at, if I were the author, what would I have happen in the second book, and this did basically everything that I anticipatingly hoped for. But there's about, I would say, 3 times as much plot in this book, and it's almost exactly the same length as the first book, so I sort of missed the slow burn, luxurious feel of the first book in this, and I found that a lot of things were happening so quickly that I thought needed more time, more discussion, more explanation, things with secondary characters, and I like the secondary characters in this series, and I think their plot lines were really strong, but they needed more detail and more attention. And so there were parts of this book that just felt very rushed to me. The first book was really heavily concerned with one central story arc that was the romance. And that story arc sort of did its thing, and in the second book it felt like it was emotionally a little unmoored. That said, I think if you liked the first book, you will like where this series goes. You will enjoy this book. I enjoyed this book. I guess I had just been hoping for a little more, given that this is the author's second book, and maybe I was hoping for a little more development in her style and her mastery of her writing, and I ended up getting something that felt a little more hastily written. So that's sort of my overall summary of the 2 books. This duology centers around a protagonist who is incredibly headstrong. That is the type of protagonist she is. She is a headstrong female protagonist. She is set against a backdrop where there are several male characters who tend to think they know what is best for her, and she has to prove them wrong repeatedly. She has a fiery temper. Her character doesn't really change a lot over the course of the story, but if this is a type of protagonist you like to read, then you will enjoy reading about her for 2 books. The magical element was really subtle in the first book. It was mostly just little seeds that seemed to be planted for the purpose of things that happened in this book. I felt like the magical powers and so forth was one element of this that was also treated way too hastily. Anyhow, I think that's all for now. Let me know if you've read these books, what you thought of them, if you want to read these books. If you are undecided, feel free to ask me questions and I will answer them as well as I can. If I think of anything I forgot to say, I'll stick it in my wrap-up when I wrap this book up for the month. But for now, it's going back to the library. Okay. Nice talking with you all. Bye for now.